They treated him like a nobody, slammed him to the ground, cuffed him like a street thug, and laughed as blood ran down his face. Why? Because he stayed silent. Because they didn't recognize the regimental patch on the bag they had just stomped into the dirt. What they didn't know was that the man they'd just taken down wasn't some imposter, he was a royal guard. And just 5 minutes later, a colonel arrived who made sure they'd never make that mistake again. Before we show you what happened next, be sure to subscribe and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. What comes next might just restore your faith in justice. The rain hammered against the glass walls of Heathrow Airport's Terminal 5, like nature's own percussion section. Each droplet a reminder that even London's grandest airport couldn't escape the city's perpetual drizzle. Inside the arrivals hall, weary travelers dragged their luggage across polished floors, their conversations a low murmur punctuated by the occasional announcement echoing through the cavernous space. Most people moved with the hurried desperation of those eager to reach their destinations, but one figure remained perfectly still. Lance Sergeant Daniel Wicks stood near Exit 3 like a statue carved from granite, his civilian clothes a simple navy jacket and dark trousers doing nothing to diminish the military bearing that seemed to radiate from his very bones. At his feet lay a long garment bag, its leather surface bearing the distinctive badge of the Coldstream Guards, a star and garter that had witnessed more history than most buildings. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter steel, tracked the crowd with the methodical precision of a man trained to see everything while revealing nothing. To the casual observer, Wicks appeared to be just another passenger waiting for transport, but there was something unsettling about his stillness, the way he held himself with perfect posture despite having spent the last 18 hours traveling from a classified location in the Middle East. His hands remained at his sides, never fidgeting, never checking his phone, never betraying the exhaustion that should have been written across his features. After the grueling journey home, what most people didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Daniel Wicks had spent the last 6 months protecting British interests in places that didn't officially exist on any map. The 28-year-old had volunteered for the deployment after his younger brother Michael had been killed in a training accident at Catterick Garrison. The guilt had eaten at him like acid, the knowledge that he'd been the one to encourage Michael to enlist, to follow in his footsteps into the Guards. The mission overseas had been his way of running from that pain, of losing himself in the mechanical precision of duty. Now he was home, carrying nothing but the ceremonial uniform he'd worn to represent the crown at a memorial service for fallen Commonwealth soldiers. The red tunic folded inside that bag had stood at attention in temperatures that would have felled lesser men, had remained pressed and immaculate through sandstorms and mortar fire. It was more than cloth and thread, it was a symbol of 5 centuries of unwavering service, of men who had died for ideals that transcended individual comfort or safety. PC James Reeves noticed the motionless figure from his patrol car parked near the terminal entrance. At 34, Reeves had spent 8 years in the Metropolitan Police, long enough to develop what he considered a sixth sense for trouble. His receding hairline and the soft paunch round his middle spoke to too many years of desk work and not enough physical activity. But his eyes still held the suspicious glint of a man who'd seen enough of humanity's darker impulses to trust no one. "Check out RoboCop over there," Reeves muttered to his partner, Sergeant Matt Collins, nodding toward Wicks's. "Bloke's been standing there for 20 minutes without moving. 5 quid says he's carrying something he shouldn't be." Collins, younger and more eager to prove himself, squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. "Could be waiting for someone. Airport's full of people waiting." "Not like that," Reeves replied, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd made similar judgments 1,000 times before. "Look at him. Too rigid, too alert. Normal people don't stand that still unless they're hiding something." The 2 officers climbed out of their vehicle, rain immediately soaking through their high-visibility jackets. Reeves adjusted his utility belt, the weight of his baton and cuffs a familiar comfort against his hip. They approached Wicks's with the careful steps of predators circling prey, their movements designed to intimidate and control. Before they could even speak, Wicks's had produced his military identification card, extending it with movements so smooth they seemed choreographed. His voice was calm, professional, utterly without inflection. "Good afternoon, officers. Lance, Sergeant Daniel Wicks's 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards." Reeves snatched the ID with more force than necessary, his eyes narrowing as he examined it under the terminal's harsh fluorescent lighting. The photograph showed the same pale blue eyes, the same angular features, But something about the man's stillness rankled him. In Reeves' experience, innocent people were nervous around police, deferential, eager to please. This soldier's calm felt like a challenge. Queen's Guard, Reeves said, his tone dripping with skepticism. Fancy that. Let's see what's in the bag, soldier. Wickes didn't move, didn't even shift his weight. His gaze remained fixed on a point somewhere beyond the officer's shoulders. A trick learned during countless hours of sentry duty when movement was forbidden, and attention was everything. Ceremonial uniform, sir. Wool and gold thread. I'd prefer not to open it in the rain. The refusal polite, reasonable, but still a refusal hit Reeves like a slap. His face darkened, jaw clenching with the kind of anger that came from having his authority questioned. Without warning, he drove the toe of his boot into the garment bag, the impact sending a spray of water across the leather surface. For the first time, Wickes reacted. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping just beneath the skin. It was the smallest possible response, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But Reeves was looking, and he saw it as weakness, as proof that the soldier could be broken. I said open it, Reeves barked, his voice echoing off the terminal walls. Several passengers turned to look, their conversations dying as they sensed the tension crackling between the three men. Wickes finally met his eyes, and for a moment, Reeves saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear or anger, it was assessment. The calculating look of a man determining whether his opponent represented a genuine threat. The soldier's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath the politeness now. Sir, I am required to protect this uniform from damage. It belongs to the crown, not to me. The words were like gasoline on a fire. Reeves grabbed Wickes by the arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of the jacket. You'll do what I bloody tell you to do, or you'll find yourself in cuffs. What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a car crash. Reeves threw a wild haymaker punch, the kind of sloppy blow that came from anger rather than training. Wickes saw it coming from miles away. His reflexes, honed by years of combat training, could have easily deflected it, could have put the police officer on his back before he knew what hit him. Instead, he made a choice that would echo through the events to come. He took the punch. The blow caught him high on the cheek, snapping his head to the side and opening a cut just below his left eye. Pain flared through his skull, but Wickes didn't retaliate, didn't even stumble. He simply absorbed the impact and remained standing, his hands still at his sides, his breathing unchanged. The restraint required was enormous. Every fiber of his training screamed at him to respond, to neutralize the threat, to protect himself. But he was a Queen's Guard, and Queen's Guards did not brawl in airport terminals. The crowd around them gasped as one, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck all the oxygen from the immediate area. A woman in a red jacket raised her phone, already recording, her face pale with shock. Children were hustled away by their parents, but many adults remained, transfixed by the spectacle of a uniformed officer striking someone who hadn't raised a hand in defense. Reeves, emboldened by the lack of resistance, forced Wickes to the wet pavement. The soldier's knees hit the ground with a splash that sent dirty water across his trousers. But he didn't resist, didn't fight back. He simply knelt there in the rain, blood trickling from his split cheek, as Reeves fumbled for his handcuffs. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and failure to comply with a police order, Reeves announced, his voice shaking slightly, with adrenaline and the knowledge that he'd just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Flight Lieutenant Sarah Morrison had been watching the entire scene unfold from the terminal's upper level, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she witnessed what she could only describe as an assault on a fellow service member. At 42, Morrison had spent 2 decades in the Royal Air Force, long enough to recognize the uniform bearing of a Guards soldier even in civilian clothes. She'd served alongside Coldstream Guards in Afghanistan, had seen firsthand the kind of discipline and professionalism that marked the elite infantry regiment. Her phone was already in her hand, fingers flying over the screen as she dialed a number she knew by heart. The connection was almost immediate, the voice on the other end crisp and authoritative. Henshaw, Colonel, it's Morrison. We've got a situation at Heathrow. One of your Coldstream Guards is in handcuffs, and he didn't resist, not even when they struck him. There was a pause, the kind of silence that preceded a storm. Colonel Alastair Henshaw was not a man given to emotional outbursts, but Morrison could practically hear the ice forming in his voicey details. Lance. Sergeant, I think. Military ID produced immediately. They demanded he open his kit bag. He politely refused due to the rain. And then they escalated. The PC threw a punch. The soldier took it without retaliation. It's all on video. Another pause. Longer this time. When Henshaw spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Stay where you are. Document everything. I'm en route. The line went dead, leaving Morrison staring at her phone with the certainty that she just witnessed the opening act of something much larger than a simple arrest. Below her, Wickses remained kneeling in the rain, his bearing unchanged despite the handcuffs and the blood still trickling from his cheek. The crowd had grown larger, phones recording from every angle, but the soldier's expression remained perfectly neutral, as if he were standing guard at Buckingham Palace rather than being detained at an airport. The black Range Rover appeared at the terminal entrance, exactly 14 minutes after Morrison's call, its arrival marked by the screech of brakes and the immediate attention of everyone in the vicinity. The vehicle's occupant emerged with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Colonel Alastair Henshaw, at 53, was a man who had earned his rank through 2 decades of service in some of the world's most dangerous places. His steel-gray eyes missed nothing. His bearing spoke of absolute confidence, and his presence seemed to change the very atmosphere around him. Henshaw was no stranger to conflict. He'd commanded troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, had been responsible for the lives of hundreds of soldiers in conditions that would have broken lesser men. But what he saw as he approached the crowd around Wickses ignited something cold and terrible in his chest. A Queen's Guard, his Queen's Guard kneeling in the rain like a common criminal, blood on his face, while police officers stood over him with the satisfied expressions of men who believed they'd done good work. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, sensing instinctively that this was a man who commanded respect through presence alone. Henshaw's eyes locked onto Wickses first, conducting a rapid assessment. The soldier's bearing remained perfect despite his circumstances, his breathing controlled, his expression neutral. Good, the discipline held. Then Henshaw's gaze shifted to the 2 police officers, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. Reeves, still riding the adrenaline high of his perceived victory, stepped forward with the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards. Sir. This man was resisting lawful orders in silence. The word cut through the air like a blade, delivered with such authority that Reeves' mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. Henshaw moved past him without another glance, kneeling beside the garment bag that had started this entire incident. With movements that spoke of reverence rather than mere curiosity, he pulled back the zipper and folded the leather away from its contents. The ceremonial uniform was revealed like a religious relic, the scarlet tunic pristine despite its travels, the gold thread catching the terminal's harsh lights and throwing them back in brilliant flashes. The sight of it seemed to electrify the crowd. Even those who knew nothing of military protocol could sense they were looking at something important, something that transcended mere clothing. Henshaw's voice, when he spoke, could have frozen hell itself. This uniform has stood at the cenotaph for 100 years. It has been worn by men who died for ideals you couldn't begin to comprehend. And you dared to lay hands on the man who wears it. Each word was delivered with the precision of a sniper's bullet, designed to find its target and inflict maximum damage. Reeves' face had gone white, the full implications of his actions finally beginning to penetrate his consciousness. He'd assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard, one of the most elite and respected units in the British military, and he'd done it in front of dozens of witnesses. Henshaw rose to his feet, his movements fluid despite his age, and produced his phone. His voice carried the kind of authority that brooked no argument, the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed instantly and without question. This is Colonel Henshaw, 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards. I need a military police detail at Heathrow Airport immediately. We have officers who have assaulted active duty personnel, and I want them arrested under Section 24 of the Armed Forces Act. The words hit Reeves like physical blows. Military Police, Armed Forces Act. This wasn't just a complaint to be filed and forgotten. This was a formal military response to an assault on Crown personnel. The implications were staggering, the potential consequences career-ending. Now see here, Reeves began, his voice cracking slightly. We were just doing our job. We had reasonable suspicion. Reasonable suspicion of what? Henshaw's voice was like Arctic wind. A soldier returning from deployment, a man carrying ceremonial uniform, a guard who produced identification before being asked and answered every question with military courtesy. He stepped closer, and Reeves involuntarily stepped back. Or did you have reasonable suspicion that someone was showing you more respect than you deserved? The military police arrived with the efficiency that marked all things military. 6 soldiers in combat fatigues, their movements precise and purposeful, their presence transforming the scene from civilian law enforcement matter to military tribunal. The lead sergeant, a weathered man in his 40s with the kind of eyes that had seen too much, approached Henshaw with a crisp salute. "Sir, Staff Sergeant Williams, military police. We understand there's been an incident involving one of our personnel." Henshaw returned the salute with mechanical precision before gesturing toward Wicks's, still kneeling in the rain, his composure unbroken despite everything that had happened. Lance Sergeant Wicks's was assaulted by these officers while attempting to comply with their requests. He showed remarkable restraint in not defending himself. Williams nodded, his expression grim. He'd dealt with civilian military incidents before, but an assault on a Queen's Guard was something different entirely. These weren't just soldiers, they were the public face of the British military, representatives of centuries of tradition and honor. "Officers," Williams addressed Reeves and Collins, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You are under arrest for assault on active duty military personnel. You have the right to remain silent, but I should warn you that anything you say will be used against you in a military tribunal." The irony was not lost on anyone present. The handcuffs that had been meant for Wicks's were now being applied to the wrists of the men who had put them on him. Reeves struggled briefly, his face flushed with indignation and growing panic. "This is outrageous. We're police officers. You can't just—" "We can, and we are," Henshaw interrupted, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "Section 24 of the Armed Forces Act gives us jurisdiction over crimes committed against military personnel. Your authority ends where ours begins." As the military police led the 2 officers away, Henshaw finally turned his attention to Wicks's, who had remained kneeling throughout the entire confrontation. The colonel's voice softened slightly, though it retained its underlying steel. "Up, guardsmen. The Queen's uniform doesn't kneel." Wicks's rose to his feet with the same fluid grace that had marked all his movements. Despite the handcuffs still binding his wrists, Henshaw produced a key where he'd obtained it. No one asked and released the restraints with movements that spoke of long practice. The soldier's first action was to check his garment bag, ensuring that the uniform inside remained undamaged despite its rough treatment. "Thank you, sir," Wicks's said simply, his voice carrying the kind of gratitude that came from being understood by someone who shared the same values, the same commitment to something larger than themselves. Henshaw studied the younger man's face, noting the cut on his cheek, the slight swelling around his left eye. "You took that punch well, Sergeant. Any other man might have responded differently." "Any other man isn't a Queen's Guard, sir." The simple statement carried a weight that transcended its brevity. It spoke to training that went beyond the physical, to a mindset that valued duty above personal comfort, honor above personal safety. Henshaw had served alongside men like Wicks's for his entire career, but he never stopped being impressed by their capacity for restraint, their ability to absorb punishment without abandoning their principles. "The incident will be fully investigated," Henshaw continued, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. "What they did to you was not just assault, it was an attack on everything we represent. That will not go unanswered." As they spoke, the crowd began to disperse, but not before dozens of phones had captured every moment of the confrontation. The video would be online within hours, shared across social media platforms with captions that ranged from outrage to admiration. The image of a soldier taking a punch without retaliation, of military discipline triumphing over civilian aggression, would resonate with millions of viewers. The woman in the red jacket, who had been among the first to start recording, approached hesitantly. Her face was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she held her phone. "Excuse me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I recorded everything, if you need it for evidence." Henshaw nodded gravely. "That would be very helpful. Mom, Staff Sergeant Williams will take your contact information." The next morning dawned gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to reflect the somber mood hanging over the city. The story had exploded across social media overnight. The video of Wicks's taking the punch without retaliation viewed millions of times. News outlets had picked up the story, with headlines ranging from police assault on Queen's Guard to military discipline versus civilian authority. But for Wicks's himself, the morning began as it always did, with duty. He stood at his post outside Buckingham Palace, resplendent in the full ceremonial uniform that had caused so much trouble the day before. The scarlet tunic was immaculate, the gold thread gleaming in the pale sunlight. The bearskin hat sitting at precisely the correct angle to anyone passing by. He might have been carved from stone, his bearing perfect, his attention absolute. The bruise on his cheek had darkened overnight, a purple-black mark that stood out starkly against his pale skin. But if it caused him any discomfort, he gave no sign. Queen's guards were trained to stand motionless for hours at a time, to ignore pain, heat, cold, and distraction. A bruise was nothing compared to the demands of the post out at 080 hours precisely. A familiar figure appeared at the palace gates. The woman in the red jacket from the airport stood uncertainly on the pavement, her eyes fixed on Wix's with an expression that mixed admiration with something approaching awe. She carried herself differently than she had the day before, straighter, more purposeful, as if witnessing his restraint had somehow changed her understanding of what courage looked like. For a long moment, she simply stood there, studying the soldier who had become an overnight symbol of military discipline. Then, with movements that seemed to surprise even herself, she raised her hand in a salute. It was inexpert, civilian, but it carried a sincerity that made it more meaningful than any parade ground precision. Wix's eyes, which had been fixed on the middle distance in the traditional manner of sentries, flickered slightly in acknowledgement. It was the smallest possible response, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But to the woman, it was enough. She smiled, nodded once, and walked away, her steps lighter than they had been in months. 3 weeks later, the military tribunal convened in a stark courtroom at Aldershot Garrison, the spiritual home of the British Army. The proceedings were closed to the public, but the gallery was packed with military personnel, their faces grave, as they prepared to witness justice for one of their own. The atmosphere was electric with tension, the kind of anticipation that preceded a verdict that would send ripples through both military and civilian law enforcement. Reeves and Collins sat at the defendant's table, their faces pale with the knowledge that their careers and possibly their freedom hung in the balance. The assault on Wix's had been captured from multiple angles, the video evidence so clear that their solicitor had advised them to enter guilty pleas and hope for leniency. But both men had refused, clinging to the belief that their actions had been justified, that they had been simply doing their jobs. The presiding judge, Brigadier James Harrington, was a man who had spent 3 decades in military law, his understanding of both military discipline and civilian authority refined by years of experience. He called the court to order with the kind of authority that brooked no argument, his voice carrying across the courtroom like the crack of a whip. The defendants are charged with assault on active-duty military personnel under Section 24 of the Armed Forces Act. How do you plead? Not guilty, Your Honor, Reeves replied, his voice barely steady. We were acting within our authority as police officers. The prosecutor, Major Patricia Sinclair, rose to her feet with the fluid grace of someone who had never lost a case. She was a woman who had built her career on attention to detail, on the methodical destruction of defense arguments through the simple presentation of facts. Her opening statement was a masterpiece of controlled fury. Your Honor, the defendants didn't just assault Lance Sergeant Wix's, they assaulted everything he represents. The Queen's Guard is not merely a military unit. It is a symbol of British values, of the restraint and discipline that define our armed forces. When they struck him, they struck at the very heart of what makes our military the finest in the world. She activated the courtroom's video system, and the airport footage filled the large screen mounted on the wall. The impact was immediate and devastating. Wix is standing motionless, producing his identification without being asked, politely explaining his position, never raising his voice or showing the slightest aggression. And then Reeves' wild punch, the soldier's refusal to retaliate, his calm acceptance of violence he could have easily prevented. Watch his face, Sinclair continued, her voice soft but carrying clearly throughout the courtroom. See the moment he makes the choice not to defend himself. That, Your Honor, is discipline. That is the difference between a trained soldier and a common thug. The footage continued, showing Wix's kneeling in the rain, blood trickling from his cheek, his composure unbroken despite the handcuffs and the hostile crowd. Several officers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride in their fellow soldier and anger at those who had attacked him. The defense attorney, a civilian solicitor named Robert Pemberton, rose to present his case with the kind of desperate confidence that marked lawyers who knew they were fighting a losing battle. He argued that his clients had been acting within their authority, that they had reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, that Wicks's refusal to open his bag constituted obstruction of justice. "My clients are dedicated police officers," Pemberton argued, his voice carrying a note of pleading. "They saw what they believed to be suspicious behavior and acted accordingly. The fact that Lance Sergeant Wicks is a soldier doesn't place him above the law." Major Sinclair's response was swift and merciless. "The defendant's authority extends to reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. What crime did they suspect? Carrying a ceremonial uniform, standing too still, showing too much discipline." She gestured toward the screen, where the video had been paused at the moment of impact. This was not law enforcement, this was brutality, pure and simple. The trial lasted 2 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony of witnesses unshakable. Flight Lieutenant Morrison described what she had seen, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had served alongside Guards soldiers and understood their true nature. The woman in the red jacket testified about the soldiers' restraint, her words painting a picture of discipline that transcended normal human responses. But it was Wicks himself who provided the most powerful testimony. Called to the stand on the second day, he answered every question with the same calm precision that had marked his behavior at the airport. His voice never rose, his expression never changed. His bearing remained perfect despite the circumstances. "Did you consider defending yourself when PC Reeves struck you?" Major Sinclair asked. "No, ma'am." "Why not?" Wicks was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes fixed on something beyond the courtroom walls. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of military tradition. "Because I am a Queen's Guard, ma'am. We do not brawl in public. We do not abandon our discipline because others have abandoned theirs. We stand firm, no matter what." The courtroom was silent except for the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen. Even Pemberton seemed to recognize that no cross-examination could shake testimony delivered with such quiet conviction. When Brigadier Harrington delivered his verdict, his voice carried the finality of military justice. "The defendants are found guilty of assault on active duty military personnel. They will be sentenced to 6 months imprisonment, to be served concurrently with dismissal from the Metropolitan Police Service." As the gavel fell, Wicks remained standing at attention, his expression unchanged. Justice had been served, but for him, it was simply another day of duty completed. The Queen's Guard had stood firm, and the discipline had held outside the courtroom. Colonel Henshaw approached his soldier with something approaching a smile. "Well done, Sergeant. The Crown is proud." Wicks saluted with mechanical precision. "Thank you, sir. Just doing my duty." And in that simple exchange lay the truth that the tribunal had recognized. That true strength didn't lie in the ability to strike back, but in the discipline to stand firm when others would fall. The Queen's Guard had been tested, and they had not been found wanting. The uniform that had started it all hung in Wicks's quarters that night, cleaned and pressed and ready for the next day's duty. It would continue to stand at attention, a symbol of values that transcended individual comfort or safety. And somewhere in London, a woman in a red jacket would remember the soldier who had shown her what real courage looked like, not the courage to fight, but the courage to stand firm when fighting would have been easier. True strength, as the tribunal had learned, stands silent,